In this video, we're going to discuss how our close relationships can affect our health. To start, I'll give you an overview of one of the most influential theories in the close relationships literature, attachment theory. First, human babies are born altricial, which basically just means that they're born essentially prematurely compared to the newborns of other species. Because of this, human babies must maintain proximity with their primary caregivers, usually the mother, while still exploring and learning from their environments. Thus, the primary caregiver is a secure base from which babies can explore. Babies form attachment styles in order to maximize their proximity with their primary caregivers. The attachment style a baby adopts will depend upon the kind of care they receive from their primary caregiver. Mary Ainsworth studied these attachment styles using the strange situation paradigm. The following video outlines how babies' attachment styles are classified using the strange situation paradigm.
This experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
Okay, this bunny is going to go here, and that bunny will be on top.
The value of the test has been established in studies that would watch a child, 1-year-old, and then follow it up and interview them about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. So we're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
Peter, that's Peter.
After several minutes' play, the mother is signaled to leave the room.
Sweetie, I'll be back in 1 minute, okay? I'll get you back in 1 minute.
It's upsetting for you. Shame, I feel. But she'll survive. The key moment in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
Honey, hi. Hi, honey. It's okay.
The important clue is whether the baby's able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother and get back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. But you see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with the mother. She's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys where we started.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes, yes.
She's certainly much happier.
Goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, but the point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure attachment?
Yes, insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her, and it's not the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we got a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
According to attachment theory, our attachment styles are fairly well developed by around 6 months of age. To help you understand adult attachment styles, We'll first go over infant attachment styles. Infants can be categorized into one of 4 attachment styles. Securely attached infants use their parents as a secure base. When they're separated from their parents, they may cry, but when their parents return, they actively seek them out and are happy to be reunited with them. Infants who are categorized with avoidant attachment styles are unresponsive to their parents' presence. They react similarly to strangers as they do with their parents. If their parents leave and then return, these infants seem to avoid their parents. Infants with resistant attachment seem to cling to their parents to the point of being unable to explore new surroundings. When their parents leave, these infants become very distressed, and when their parents return, these infants are clingy and hostile at the same time. And they're essentially unable to be comforted by their parents. A fourth, quite rare attachment style is disorganized attachment. Infants with disorganized attachment show the greatest insecurity. When their parents return after an absence, these infants show confused, contradictory behaviors, as if they're not really sure how to act around their parents. So why do babies adopt each of these attachment styles? Well, we'll focus on the 3 most common attachment styles and kind of just ignore disorganized attachment for now. Well, first, secure infants have parents who are consistently caregiving and responsive to their needs, so they learn that they can trust their mother as a secure base and turn to them in times of need. Resistant infants, on the other hand, have a primary caregiver who's less consistent in their caregiving and less responsive to their infant's needs. However, they do show caregiving behaviors. Because of this, the infant learns that love and caregiving is possible, but not guaranteed, so it's best to be clingy in order to maintain proximity with their inconsistently caring primary caregiver. Avoidantly attached infants, on the other hand, have consistently uncaring caregivers. So these infants learn that they should probably just learn to be self-sufficient. They can't really rely on their primary caregiver as a source of care. In the last 20 years or so, researchers have extended the logic of infant attachment to adult relationships. Research suggests that the correlations between infant and adult attachment are in the 0.2 to 0.4 range. This suggests that our relationships with our primary caregivers have some impact on the relationships we have with attachment figures, our significant others, in adulthood. However, the low to moderate correlations between adult and infant attachment mean that the attachments we form with our primary caregivers during infancy don't doom us to insecure relationships with our partners when we're adults if our parenting was less than perfect. Additionally, the attachments we form toward different significant others can be different. We might have an uncaring significant other during one stage of our life with whom we have an insecure attachment to, but we might form a secure attachment to a future relationship partner who's consistently caring and responsive to our needs. One way of thinking about adult attachment is that our adult attachment style is a function of 2 dimensions: anxiousness, which is similar to resistant infant attachment. Anxiousness is determined by the degree to which we have a negative view of ourselves. The second dimension is avoidance, which is influenced by the degree to which we have a negative view of others. Scales that measure anxiousness include items like, I often worry that my partners don't really love me. Others often are reluctant to get as close as I would like. I often want to merge completely with others, and this desire sometimes scares them away. Scales that measure avoidance include items like, Others often want me to be more intimate than I feel comfortable being. I find it difficult to trust others completely, and I'm not very comfortable having to depend on other people. So we put these two dimensions together, and we have 4 potential adult attachment styles. People who are high on avoidance and low on anxiousness are referred to as being dismissively avoidant. These people have positive views of themselves, but negative views of other people. They might have a working model of relationships in their mind that states something like, I'm self-sufficient and others aren't worth my time. Those who are high on both avoidance and anxiousness are referred to as fearfully avoidant. These people have a negative view of themselves and of other people. So these people might have a working model of relationships that goes something like, I am an unlovable person and others can see that in me. People who are high on anxiousness and low on avoidance are referred to simply as having an anxious attachment style. These people have a working model of relationships that might go something like, if I was more lovable, others would provide me with love. And then finally, people who are low on both anxiousness and avoidance are referred to as securely attached. These people have a positive view of both themselves and other people, and they might have a working model of relationships that states something like, I'm a lovable person and others will provide me with love. Unsurprisingly, secure attachment is associated with all kinds of positive relationship outcomes. These securely attached individuals tend to have more trust in their relationships. They tend to have happier relationships. They tend to be more committed. They tend to use conflicts constructively, and they tend to provide support appropriately when their partner needs it. Now we're going to go over 2 studies that demonstrate how our attachment styles affect our relationships. In the first study, Diamond and Hicks investigated if attachment style affected men's ability to regulate their emotions and recover from feelings of anger and anxiety. In this study, all of the participants were male. To induce anger and anxiety, all participants had to participate in a stress task known as the Trier Social Stress Task. In this task, you have to count backwards by 7s from a ridiculously high number like 8,643. You have to perform this task for a few minutes, and about every 30 seconds the researcher basically belittles you. You're told that you're either going too slowly, or that you counted wrong and therefore have to start all over again, or that you're much slower on this task than other people tend to be. Basically, it's a stressful task that definitely leads to negative emotions. After this task, participants were told to sit quietly. Then the researchers measured the men's ability to recover from their feelings of anger and anxiety. To measure emotional recovery, they measured the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. Remember that your sympathetic nervous system gets activated when you're stressed, and your parasympathetic nervous system becomes activated when you're calming down. So measuring the parasympathetic nervous system would be a good way of measuring emotion regulation. They measured parasympathetic nervous system functioning by assessing heart rate and breathing. Basically, if these rates are decreasing, then you're activating your parasympathetic nervous system. The researchers found that the men with anxious attachment styles had a harder time recovering from the emotional task. This occurred because they had a harder time turning on their parasympathetic nervous system. Basically, it seems like men with anxious attachment styles struggle with activating their parasympathetic nervous system, and this leads to a more difficult time trying to recover from being anxious and angry. The previous study focused on anxious attachment styles. This study focused on avoidant attachment styles. Additionally, this study included 148 male and female participants. These researchers were interested in learning how avoidant attachment style might affect emotional reactivity. During this study, the participants underwent the same stress task, the Trier social stress task, along with 2 other stress tasks, which means these participants engaged in 10 to 15 minutes of stressful tasks. After the stress tasks, the participants were asked to sit quietly while their emotional reactivity was measured. In this study, they measured participants' skin conductance levels. Higher skin conductance reactivity would suggest greater sympathetic nervous system arousal, and therefore greater stress levels. The researchers found that avoidantly attached individuals showed the highest amount of sympathetic nervous system activity. However, they self-reported having very low reactivity. This means that they told the researchers that they felt calm, but their body was saying the opposite. This also means that avoidantly attached individuals have a hard time calming themselves down after a stressor. This means that there's a psychological cost to repressing our emotions. Now we're going to move on to marriage and health, which is where the main focus is within this area of health psychology. The biggest question is simply, are married people healthier than unmarried people? We're going to look at research that suggests that overall, yes, married people are healthier than unmarried people, but with a few caveats. So overall, married people have better health outcomes compared to divorced, single, and never married people. Married individuals tend to be healthier, engaged in better health practices, and live longer. To show this overall effect, we're going to talk about 3 studies that have shown strong evidence for the marriage effect. In the first study, researchers compared married people to unmarried people on multiple measures of health. These researchers looked at a huge sample of 40,000 adults who were medical and surgical patients from 1988 to 2001. Overall, they found that married people stayed in the hospital 8% less time than unmarried people, paid 5% less on their hospital bills than unmarried people, and came in with fewer severe illnesses than unmarried people, 32% versus 40%. Some of these numbers might not seem too impressive, but if you think about it, a 5% difference on a huge hospital bill can be huge. Additionally, all of these differences were statistically significant. In the second study, researchers compared married people to unmarried people on different outcomes of cancer diagnosis. Again, these researchers looked at a large sample of 30,000 adult cancer patients. They found that unmarried people had a 25% greater risk of not surviving cancer. However, this effect might have nothing to do with marriage, but with some third variable. They did find that unmarried people were diagnosed at a later stage of cancer, but even after controlling for stage of diagnosis, they still found that unmarried people didn't survive as long. Additionally, they found that unmarried people received less treatment, but even after controlling for amount of treatment, unmarried people still didn't survive as long as married people. This suggests that there might actually be something about being married that's protective against cancer. In the third study, the researchers invested the outcomes of 1,400 heart attack patients. They looked at in-hospital fatalities and mortality rates after the initial heart attack. They found that married people had lower rates of in-hospital fatality compared to unmarried people, and that married people were more likely to have survived 10 years later after the initial heart attack compared to unmarried people. So far, we've been discussing the health benefits of marriage as if men and women benefit equally from being married. However, researchers have found that there are gender differences in the health benefits of being married. Overall, marriage appears to be healthier for men, whereas women see a 50% increase in their health benefits by being married. Men see a 250% increase in their health benefits. Why might there be this gender discrepancy in health benefits from being married? Well, first, women do more to control men's health behaviors than men do to control women's health. What that means is that women do more to get their husband to be healthy, such as going to the doctor, than men do for their wives. Additionally, social integration is inversely associated with negative health habits. We've already learned that having larger social networks is good for you and your health. Well, women tend to already have a really good social network when entering into a marriage. Therefore, they don't see as much of an increase in health as a function of their improved social networks as men do when they enter into a marriage. Third, marriage actually leads to more work and stress for women while providing a relief from housework for men. Even with women entering the workforce, there's still not an increase in men doing more housework. Therefore, women experience more stress because they now have to do 2 jobs, the work of 2 people when they're at home, and the increased stress isn't going to be beneficial for these women's health. Lastly, women see their doctors more often than men. This probably makes women more healthy than men even before they get married. This also doesn't mean women are less healthy than men, just that when they are sick, they're more likely to see a doctor and get well again. So marriage is associated with better health, but why? What is it about marriage that leads to better health outcomes? One theory is that it's not that marriage is better for you, but that social isolation has a strong negative effect. That is, people who aren't married are going to suffer health consequences. Research has shown that isolation leads to increases in negative affect, a sense of alienation, loneliness, and decreases in feelings of control and self-esteem. And as we've already learned, all of these negative emotions can have a detrimental impact on our physical health. If you're stressed and you feel like you don't have any control or you're lacking self-esteem, you're constantly going to be running your stress response. Researchers have investigated the question of why marriage might lead to better health by comparing good marriages to poor quality marriages. If poor quality relationships lead to worse health outcomes than good relationships, this would suggest that the health benefits associated with marriage stem from something other than social integration. If it was simply social integration, then the quality of the relationship shouldn't necessarily matter. One group of researchers conducted a meta-analysis to look at this question. They found 64 studies that investigated relationship quality and health, and overall, they found that marital quality moderated the relationship between marital status and health. What that means is that good quality relationships were related to positive health outcomes, and poor marital relationships were associated with negative health outcomes. Poor quality relationships were characterized by low marital satisfaction, inequality in decision-making, high conflict and criticism, as well as negative communication patterns and laboratory interactions. Overall, individuals in these poor quality relationships show more signs of depression, less healthy habits, and greater activation of their stress response through more cardiovascular activity. Coyne and colleagues compared 189 individuals with high versus low quality marriages on their health outcomes after being diagnosed with congestive heart failure. They found that individuals had a 30% higher chance of being alive 4 years after living with congestive heart failure if they had a high quality relationship compared to a low quality relationship. And that's what this graph is showing you. The x-axis is the number of months from the original assessment, and the y-axis is the proportion of participants still alive. The top line represents the patients with high-quality relationships, and the bottom dotted line represents patients with low-quality relationships. Higher quality marriages have also been associated with better periodontal health, such as more frequent toothbrushing and less evidence of cavities, lower blood pressure, fewer PMS symptoms, fewer overall health complaints, and better sleep. One theory on how marriage leads to better health is the stress buffering hypothesis, which we discussed in the video on social support and coping. Remember that this hypothesis suggests that social support moderates the relationship between stress and health, preventing stress from doing its damage. That is, our health might improve because our partners help us handle stress by providing us with support, such as tangible or emotional support, that is good for our health. For example, a person with a high-quality marriage might feel less job stress because her partner provides her with helpful information or helps to reaffirm other aspects of her life. One study conducted by Cohen et al. Provided some evidence of the stress buffering hypothesis. In this study, the researchers actually focused on primates. In the study, they assigned monkeys to high-stress or low-stress social environments, high-stress environments being unstable, whereas low-stress environments were more stable. Then the researchers looked at how often the primates engaged in affiliation behaviors, so things such as grooming. They found that animals in the high-stress environment had suppressed immune systems, but the animals in the high-stress environment who also engaged in more affiliation behaviors had better functioning immune systems than those who didn't engage in such behaviors. Another group of researchers looked at the effects of relationships on rheumatoid arthritis. In this study, there were 20 women with arthritis. The researchers collected data for 1 week. They made sure to obtain subjective measures such as self-reports of stress, spouse criticism, spouse support, and frequency of positive interactions. Remember, self-reports are critical because it's how we perceive stress that really matters. They also measured objective criteria such as immune functioning and the doctor's assessment of disease activity. They found that when women were experiencing high levels of stress, but also experiencing high-quality relationships, they had less immune function, which for rheumatoid arthritis is a good thing, this being an autoimmune disease. They also didn't show any increases in disease activity, which would be expected with increased stress. These results suggest that their partners helped buffer them from the impact of the stress on their health. Another theory on how marriage leads to better health is the health behavior model, which we also discussed in the video on social support and coping. This model states that social support might lead people to engage in more healthy behaviors, perhaps because their relationship partner may pressure them to behave in healthier ways, or maybe because having a partner makes you feel loved and motivated to take better care of yourself. In this study, the researchers looked at 93 men and 117 women who were attempting to reduce their smoking. For men, social influences appeared to positively affect their ability to reduce their smoking, but for women, these influences seemed less effective. Increased reports of partners' influence were associated with greater reductions in men's smoking. However, these influences weren't apparent for women. For smoking, it appears that women have a more positive influence on men, but men don't seem to have the same influence on women smoking. Another group of researchers investigated how direct social control tactics might influence health behaviors. By direct social control tactics, I mean things like getting rid of all the cigarettes in the house, pouring out all of the vodka, or maybe not buying any more junk food, or encouraging your partner to go to the gym, things like that. These researchers conducted phone interviews of 109 couples to find out if they performed these direct social control tactics and if these tactics were related to health-enhancing behaviors. They found that these direct social control tactics were related to self-reported health-promoting behaviors, such as going to the gym or eating better. These results provide support for the health behavior model because the partner's support led to changes in behavior that led to changes in health. Another area of study within the health and relationships literature concerns research looking at health interventions that are done on couples instead of on individuals. As you'll learn a little later in the semester, the big issue with health interventions is that their effects don't tend to last very long. As soon as you stop the intervention, the health behavior change also seems to stop. Researchers thought that perhaps interventions done on couples instead of on individuals might be longer lasting. They thought this because they were hoping that the intervention effects would be supported by the couple by giving the couple a support system that would last even after the termination of the intervention. Overall, this research isn't very promising. Research on eating interventions have shown limited success during the intervention, but after the intervention is over, the effects don't seem to last. Smoking interventions also seem to be unsuccessful. Because these interventions have been so unsuccessful, researchers are beginning to look at another strategy to improve people's health. These researchers are focusing on only trying to improve the relationship quality of married individuals. They hope that if relationship quality improves, then health behaviors will improve. As of now, much more research needs to be done in this area. Now we're going to move on to a couple different types of relationships. Those we have with our pets and those we have with our friends. The pet effect asks the question, do our pets make us healthier? Well, why would our pets make us healthier? Well, for one, pets can provide social resources. They can also provide us with belongingness support, unconditional positive regard, and increased activity. These are positive things that can have a positive impact on our health. But what does the research say? Many studies have shown that individuals who have pets are healthier. For example, Allen and colleagues randomly assigned hypertensive stockbrokers to have a pet or to not have a pet. Those with a pet showed lower blood pressure compared to non-pet owners. Another example comes from research by Herzog. Herzog found that pet owners were happier, had higher self-esteem, made fewer doctor visits, missed fewer days of work, and were more physically fit. Well, this seems great. All these results seem to suggest that owning a pet makes you healthier. However, even with all these positive results, there's a lot of research out there that hasn't found any relationship between owning a pet and health, and even some research that's found that owning a pet leads to worse health outcomes. For example, in one study, researchers compared 425 heart attack victims who were pet owners to those who weren't pet owners. The heart attack victims who owned pets were more likely to die or suffer from remission within 1 year of suffering their heart attack, 22% versus 14%. With all this contradictory information, we really can't say whether pets are good for our health. We'll end the video by discussing two studies looking at the relationships between friendships and health. The first study investigated whether social norms would influence our eating behavior. Lots of previous research has looked at this area, but this work was always done with groups of strangers. The unique aspect of this study is that they actually brought groups of friends into the lab. In this study, participants came to the lab in groups of 3. These groups contained 3 close friends. During the study, the friends would be given a free snack to enjoy while discussing several different campus issues. The participants believed the goal of the study was to learn students' opinions on some current issue. However, the actual goal of the study was to see how eating norms might affect their eating behavior. The snack used in this study was freshly baked cookies that were actually baked right in the lab. So participants came to the lab and were asked to eat freshly baked chocolate chip cookies and discuss a topic with their friends. So what happened? Well, in the control condition, participants weren't given any instructions at all. They could eat cookies and no restrictions. In the social norm condition, the researcher told 2 of the 3 friends not to eat any cookies, but the researcher wouldn't say anything to the 3rd friend. In the social norm condition, the researchers wanted to see how many cookies the 3rd friend would eat when his or her friends weren't eating any cookies at all. After the friends got to discuss the topic for a little while and potentially eat cookies, they were then put into separate rooms, ostensibly so the researchers could learn their attitudes toward the topic they discussed. During this time, they were supposed to write their thoughts and attitudes toward the topic, and they were also allowed to continue eating cookies during this time if they so chose. The researchers found that social norms did have a strong influence on eating behavior. In the social norm condition, the 3rd friend ate fewer cookies during both the discussion period and while alone, writing about their attitudes toward the topic they discussed. These results showed that friends can have a strong impact on our eating behavior. The second study that investigated the links between friendships and health was conducted by Christakis and Fowler. These researchers wanted to see if obesity could spread like a contagion through social networks. As a side note, I had you read an article that criticized their research, suggesting that their results were simply a statistical artifact. I want you to keep that in mind, but as we go through this research, we're going to be assuming that there's at least some truth to the concept of obesity being a contagion. These researchers were able to look at data from the Framingham Heart Study, which followed over 12,000 individuals from 1971 to 2003. The unique aspect of this study is that in addition to following the key participants, the researchers were also able to collect information from the participants' friends. Because of all this information, the researchers were able to see the likelihood of the key participant becoming obese if their friends also became obese. Overall, they found that having an obese friend increases your odds of also becoming obese. Specifically, an individual's chance of becoming obese increased 57% if their friend was obese, it increased 20% if a friend of a friend was obese, and it increased 10% if a friend of a friend of a friend was obese. These results really do suggest that obesity may in fact be contagious. Here's a graph showing the probability that a participant, who's called the ego, will become obese based on the type of relationship they had with another individual, who's called the alter. As you can see, the largest risk came from having a mutual friend who was obese. This basically just means that both of these individuals agreed that they're friends. However, the risk is almost non-existent for neighbors and opposite-sex friends. Additionally, there's only low risk from having spouses or siblings who are obese. The following video is a TED Talk presented by one of the researchers who conducted this study. It goes into more detail about the social contagion of health behaviors. If you're interested, by all means, please continue watching. However, you won't be tested on this stuff. I just thought that you might like to be edified further on this topic.
For me, this story begins about 15 years ago when I was a hospice doctor at the University of Chicago, and I was taking care of people who were dying and their families in the south side of Chicago. And I was observing what happened to people and their families over the course of their terminal illness. And in my lab, I was studying the widower effect, which is a very old idea in the social sciences, going back 150 years, known as dying of a broken heart. So when I die, my wife's risk of death can double, for instance, in the first year. And I had gone to take care of one particular patient, a woman who was dying of dementia. And in this case, unlike this couple, she was being cared for by her daughter. And the daughter was exhausted from caring for her mother. And the daughter's husband, he also was sick from his wife's exhaustion. And I was driving home one day, and I get a phone call from the husband's friend, calling me because he was depressed about what was happening to his friend. So here I get this call from this random guy that's having an experience that's being influenced by people at some social distance. And so I suddenly realized two very simple things. First, the widowhood effect was not restricted to husbands and wives. And second, it was not restricted to pairs of people. And I started to see the world in a whole new way, like pairs of people connected to each other. And then I realized that these individuals would be connected into foursomes with other pairs of people nearby. And that in fact, these people were embedded in other sorts of relationships, marriage and spousal and friendship and other sorts of ties. And that in fact, these connections were vast, and that we were all embedded in this broad set of connections with each other. So I started to see the world in a completely new way, and I became obsessed with this. I became obsessed with how it might be that we're embedded in these social networks and how they affect our lives. So social networks are these intricate things of beauty, and they are so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, that one has to ask what purpose they serve. Why are we embedded in social networks? I mean, how do they form? How do they operate? And how do they affect us? And so my first topic with respect to this was not death, but obesity. And it had become trendy to speak about the obesity epidemic. And along with my collaborator, James Fowler, we began to wonder whether obesity really was epidemic, and could it spread from person to person like the 4 people I discussed earlier. So this is a slide of some of our initial results. It's 2,200 people in the year 2000. Every dot is a person. We make the dot size proportional to people's body size. So bigger dots are bigger people. And in addition, if your body size, if your BMI, your body mass index is above 30, if you're clinically obese, we also color the dots yellow. So if you look at this image right away, you might be able to see that there are clusters of obese and non-obese people in the image. But the visual complexity is still very high. It's not obvious exactly what's going on. In addition, some questions are immediately raised. How much clustering is there? Is there more clustering than would be due to chance alone? How big are the clusters? How far do they reach? And most importantly, what causes the clusters? So we did some mathematics to study the size of these clusters. This here shows on the y-axis the increase in the probability that a person is obese given that a social contact of theirs is obese, and on the x-axis the degrees of separation between the two people. And on the far left you see the purple line. It says that if your friends are obese, your risk of obesity is 45% higher. And the next bar over, the orange line, says if your friends' are obese, your risk of obesity is 25% higher. And then the next line over says if your friends, someone you probably don't even know is obese, your risk of obesity is 10% higher. And it's only when you get to your friends that there's no longer a relationship between that person's body size and your own body size. Well, what might be causing this clustering? There are at least 3 possibilities. One possibility is that as I gain weight, it causes you to gain weight, a kind of induction, a kind of spread from person to person. Another possibility, very obvious, is homophily, or birds of a feather flock together. Here, I form my tie to you because you and I share a similar body size. And the last possibility is what is known as confounding, because it confounds our ability to figure out what's going on. And here the idea is not that my weight gain is causing your weight gain, nor that I preferentially form a tie with you because you and I share the same body size, but rather that we share a common exposure to something like a health club that makes us both lose weight at the same time. And when we studied these data, we found evidence for all of these things, including for induction. And we found that if your friend becomes obese, it increases your risk of obesity by about 57% in the same given time period. And there can be many mechanisms for this effect. One possibility is that your friends say to you something like, they adopt a behavior that spreads to you, like they say, let's go have muffins and beer, which is a terrible combination. But you adopt that combination, and then you start gaining weight like them. And another more subtle possibility is that they start gaining weight, and it changes your ideas of what an acceptable body size is. And here what's spreading from person to person is not a behavior, but rather a norm. An idea is spreading. Now, headline writers had a field day with our studies. I think the headline in the New York Times was, you know, are you packing it on? Blame your fat friends. What was interesting to us is the European headline writers had a different take. They said, you know, are your friends gaining weight? Perhaps you are to blame. And we thought this was a very interesting comment on American, you know, kind of self-serving, you know, not my responsibility kind of phenomenon. Now, I want to be very clear, we do not think our work should or could justify prejudice against people of one or another body size at all. Now, our next question was, could we actually visualize this spread? Was weight gain in one person actually spreading to weight gain in another person? And this is complicated because we needed to take into account the fact that the network structure, the architecture of the ties, was changing across time. And in addition, because obesity is not a unicentric epidemic, there's not like a patient zero of the obesity epidemic. We find that guy, you know, there was a spread of obesity out from him. It's a multicentric epidemic. Lots of people are doing things at the same time. And I'm about to show you a 30-second video animation that took me 5 years, me and James, 5 years of our lives to do. And so again, every dot is a person, every tie between them is a relationship, and we're going to put this into motion now, taking daily cuts through the network for about 30 years. The dot sizes are going to grow. You're going to see a sea of yellow take over. You're going to see people be born and die. Dots will appear and disappear. Ties will form and break. Marriages will and divorces, friendings and defriendings. A lot of complexity. A lot is happening just in these 30-year period that includes the obesity epidemic. And by the end, you're going to see clusters of obese and non-obese individuals within the network. Now, when I looked at this, it changed the way I see things. Because this network that's changing across time has a memory, it moves, things flow within it, it has a kind of consistency. People can die, but it doesn't die, it still persists. And it has a kind of resilience that allows it to persist across time. And so I came to see these kinds of social networks as living things that we could put under a kind of microscope and study and analyze and understand. And we used a variety of techniques to do this, and we started exploring all kinds of other phenomena. So we looked at smoking and drinking behavior and voting behavior and divorce, which can spread, and altruism. And eventually, we became interested in emotions. Now, when we have emotions, we show them. Why do we show our emotions? I mean, there would be an advantage to experiencing our emotions inside, you know, anger or happiness. But we don't just experience them, we show them. And not only do we show them, but others can read them. And not only can they read them, but they copy them. There's emotional contagion that takes place in human populations. And so this function of emotions suggests that in addition to any other purpose they serve, they're a kind of primitive form of communication. And that in fact, if we really want to understand human emotions, we need to think about them in this way. Now, we're accustomed to thinking about emotions in this way in simple, sort of brief periods of time. So for example, I was giving this talk recently in New York City, and I said, you know, like how when you're on the subway and the other person across the subway car smiles at you, and you just instinctively smile back. And they looked at me and said, we don't do that in New York City. And I said, everywhere else in the world, that's normal human behavior. And so there's a very instinctive way in which we briefly transmit emotions to each other. And in fact, emotional contagion can be broader still, like we can have punctuated expressions of anger, as in riots. The question that we wanted to ask was, could emotions spread in a more sustained way than riots across time and involve large numbers of people, not just these pair of individuals smiling at each other in the subway car? Maybe there's a kind of below-the-surface quiet riot that animates us all the time. Maybe there are emotional stampedes that ripple through human social networks. Maybe, in fact, emotions have a collective existence, not just an individual existence. And this is one of the first images we made to study this phenomenon. Again, a social network, but now we color the people yellow if they're happy, and blue if they're sad, and green in between. And if you look at this image, you can right away see clusters of happy and unhappy people, again spreading to 3 degrees of separation. And you might form the intuition that the unhappy people occupy a different structural location within the network. So there's a middle and an edge to this network, and the unhappy people seem to be located at the edges. So to invoke another metaphor, if you imagine social networks as a kind of vast fabric of humanity, I'm connected to you and you to her, on out endlessly into the distance. This fabric is actually like an old-fashioned American quilt. and it has patches on it, happy and unhappy patches. And whether you become happy or not depends in part on whether you occupy a happy patch. So, this work with emotions, which are so fundamental, then got us to thinking about maybe the fundamental causes of human social networks are somehow encoded in our genes. Because human social networks, whenever they are mapped, always kind of look like this, the picture of the network. But they never look like this. Why do they not look like this? Why don't we form human social networks that look like a regular lattice? Well, the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity and their apparent purpose, beg questions about whether we evolved to have human social networks in the first place and whether we evolved to form networks with a particular structure. And so notice, first of all, so to understand this, though, we need to dissect network structure a little bit first. And notice that every person in this network has exactly the same structural location as every other person. But that's not the case with real networks. So for example, here's a real network of college students at an elite Northeastern university. And now I'm highlighting a few dots. And if you look here at the dots, compare node B in the upper left to node D in the far right. And B has 4 friends coming out from him, and D has 6 friends coming out from him. And so those two individuals have different numbers of friends. That's very obvious. We all know that. But certain other aspects of social network structure are not so obvious. Compare node B in the upper left to node A in the lower left. And now those people both have 4 friends, but A's friends all know each other, and B's friends do not. So the friend of a friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. Whereas the friend of a friend of B's is not a friend of B's, is farther away in the network. This is known as transitivity in networks. And finally, compare nodes C and D. C and D both have 6 friends. If you talk to them, they would say, and you said, what is your social life like? They would say, I've got 6 friends. That's my social experience. But now we, with a bird's eye view looking at this network, can see that they occupy very different social worlds. And I can cultivate that intuition in you by just asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? Would you rather be C or D? You'd rather be D, on the edge of the network. And now who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip, not about you, was spreading through the network? Now you would rather be C. So different structural locations have different implications for your life. And in fact, when we did some experiments looking at this, what we found is that 46% of the variation in how many friends you have is explained by your genes. And this is not surprising. We know some people are born shy and some are born gregarious. That's obvious. But we also found some non-obvious things. For instance, 47% in the variation in whether your friends know each other is attributable to your genes. Whether your friends know each other has not just to do with their genes, but with yours. And we think the reason for this is that some people like to introduce their friends to each other, you know who you are, and others of you keep them apart and don't introduce your friends to each other. And so some people knit together the networks around them, creating a kind of dense web of ties in which they're comfortably embedded. And finally, we even found that 30% of the variation in whether or not people are in the middle or on the edge of the network can also be attributed to their genes. So whether you find yourself in the middle or on the edge is also partially heritable. Now, what is the point of this? How does this help us understand? How does this help us figure out some of the problems that are affecting us these days? Well, the argument I'd like to make is that networks have value. They are a kind of social capital. New properties emerge because of our embeddedness in social networks. And these properties inhere in the structure of the networks, not just in the individuals within them. So think about these 2 common objects. They're both made of carbon. And yet, one of them has carbon atoms in it that are arranged in one particular way on the left, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. But if you take the same carbon atoms and interconnect them a different way, you get diamond, which is clear and hard. And those properties of softness and hardness and darkness and clearness do not reside in the carbon atoms. They reside in the interconnections between the carbon atoms, or at least arise because of the interconnections between the carbon atoms. So similarly, the pattern of connections among people confers upon people, the groups of people, different properties. It is the ties between people that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And so it is not just what's happening to these people, whether they're losing weight or gaining weight or becoming rich or becoming poor or becoming happy or not becoming happy that affects us. It's also the actual architecture of the ties around us. Our experience of the world depends on the actual structure of the networks in which we're residing and on all the kinds of things that ripple and flow through the network. Now, the reason I think that this is the case is that human beings assemble themselves and form a kind of superorganism. Now, superorganism is a collection of individuals which show or evince behaviors or phenomena that are not reducible to the study of individuals and must be understood by reference to and by studying the collective. Like, for example, a hive of bees that's finding a new nesting site, or a flock of birds that's evading a predator, or a flock of birds that's able to pool their wisdom and navigate and find a tiny speck of an island in the middle of the Pacific, or a pack of wolves that's able to bring down larger prey. Superorganisms have properties that cannot be understood just by studying the individuals. I think understanding social networks and how they form and operate can help us understand not just health and emotions, but all kinds of other phenomena, like crime and warfare, and economic phenomena, like bank runs and market crashes, and the adoption of innovation and the spread of product adoption. Now, look at this. I think we form social networks because the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. If I was always violent towards you, or gave you misinformation, or made you sad, or infected you with deadly germs, you would cut the ties to me and the network would disintegrate. So the spread of good and valuable things is required to sustain and nourish social networks. Similarly, social networks are required for the spread of good and valuable things, like love and kindness and happiness and altruism and ideas. I think, in fact, that if we realized how valuable social networks are, we'd spend a lot more time nourishing them and sustaining them. Because I think social networks are fundamentally related to goodness. And what I think the world needs now is more connections. Thank you.